Welcome, everybody, to another Jump Music Initiative podcast. We have with us Mr. Russell Broom, and I'm very, very excited to have him here and ask him some questions. Russ has got a big, long resume, and I'm not going to attempt to really share with you the whole thing because I think you can check that out. But I will list off a couple of things that Russ has done. He's a JUNO nominated producer and engineer. He won JUNO Songwriter of the Year before. Multiple WCMAs. He's worked with Jann Arden, most famously, I guess. Music director for We Will Rock You and other shows. Mixed credits for a whole list of people. And, you know, Russ is just one of the Calgary greats, legends that everybody knows around here. So, Russ, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so
Can you
much.
do me a favor and just give us a little bit of a background on how you got started? I know you grew up in Calgary. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, but how old were you when you started getting into music? Did you start on the guitar? What's your initial venture? What's your way into music?
Right. Older brother and sister were my gateway drug for music because they had quite good musical taste. This is the late 70s. So, they would listen to stuff and I would kind of really... I'd go, can I borrow that record after you're finished with it? I really found that music just really resonated with me when I was a kid, when I was like 5 or 6. And then from there, they both played guitar. So I started playing guitar a bit and I took some lessons and I actually didn't like it. So I quit and played drums for a few years. And then when I was 14, I had some friends that started a band and they needed a guitar player because they already had a drummer. And being an insecure 14-year-old kid, I thought the idea of being in a band would be really kind of fun. So I got into playing guitar and absolutely fell head over heels in love with it. And it became the thing that me being an awkward 14-year-old kid, obviously I'm not that now, I'm much older, but at the time it was one of those things that rather than having to articulate my emotions or try and communicate all the things I was feeling as a sensitive kid, I could do it on the guitar, and it became this sort of valve for me emotionally. And for some reason, guitar, I had an aptitude for it. I could pick something up, I could hear something, and I could play it. And I didn't quite believe that I was doing it at first. I thought, well, it's got to be a lot harder than that. But being in a band and having to learn songs and stuff, it just really inspired me to learn all these different songs on guitar and then kind of reverse engineer the theory of it. And guitar became this obsession because it was this way of me communicating my emotions through 6 strings and an amplifier rather than having to sort of go to a bunch of therapy or talk too much to my parents or my siblings and all that stuff. So
Russ,
were you a great outlet? So
when you went back to it at 14 years old, did you again take lessons, or did you take it upon yourself to learn yourself? Are you self-taught at that point?
Mostly self-taught, and then I really got into playing jazz. So from that, I wanted to learn more about the theoretical side of it and stuff. But my problem always as a kid would be I would start learning something I had to learn for a guitar lesson, and then I would sort of hear something in it, and I'd be like, well, I could maybe write this piece of music, or this sounds like this, and I'd go off on a tangent, and 3 hours later, I hadn't really done any of the homework, yet I'd been practicing or playing the instrument for a bunch of hours. So, kind of my lack of discipline, but overabundance of passion for it sort of directed where I was going to go with music as far as how I ended up having a career in it. Because I'm not really a crafts person. I'm not like a classical musician per se, where you can put a big sheet with black dots on it in front of me and I can execute it very well and consistently. I've always been, my job as a session musician and as a co-writer and as a producer is to come up with parts for songs and to create guitar parts rather than have them dictated to me. And that was something that I started doing at a very young age, just naturally. So.
Wow.
That's awesome. I wanted to take it back a little bit more for the young artists watching. So you're kind of notorious in Calgary for being an awesome session musician. Can you kind of explain what the difference is between a session musician, a musician for hire, and then a musician who's actually like part of the band or the project?
Okay, cool. That's actually a really good question. because I think a lot of people think that a session musician is someone that shows up with a guitar or whatever instrument, has a piece of music in front of them, and just executes it into a microphone, and then they go home. And there are elements of being a session musician where that's required. That has never been my experience. So basically, it's kind of a combination of being in a band and being a hired gun, because ultimately you have to contribute musical ideas to the framework of a song. And it's very rare where I come in and the artist or the producer has a really strong idea of what they want me to do on the guitar. So with that, it's kind of like being in the band in a sense where you're playing through a song and you have to come up with your own guitar parts for it. That's just a big part of being a session musician. Now, I do a lot of stuff where it's on records, and I also do a lot of TV and film sessions. So that's a very similar sort of idea, where in TV and film, sometimes the composer has programmed a whole bunch of instruments, and then I'm the human element that goes over top. So I get a little more leeway to improvise and make things up and come up with cool sounds that sort of suit the mood of the scene. And then on a record, a lot of times you'll hear a demo of a song, which could be someone just singing with an acoustic guitar, and then within the recording session, you sort of create this band for the singer in that moment. But the thing about session musicians is that they tend to work quite quickly. They tend to be able to be really creative in the moment, and there's a tendency to have a whole bunch of different ideas ready to go at any given moment. Because if I'm playing on someone's record, and it's their record, not my record, and I'm the session musician, and I have to come up with a guitar part, and they're like, you know what? I don't really know what I want to hear, but I know I don't like that part. It's my job to go, okay, well, here's 7 other ideas, right, that are based on whatever my musical ability is or my musical experience is that I'm bringing to that situation. Rather than me getting offended and storming out of the room and saying, well, if I can't play my parts, then I don't want to be a part of it, which is more like being in a band, right? So it's kind of like you have to be very sensitive to the people you are working for and working with as a session musician, but you also have to have a deep well of creativity to draw from, and you also have to look at it through the lens that it's not about you as the session musician, it's about the artist, and ultimately you're trying to create a product for that artist that they feel confident and they feel like it's their best work they've ever done, and you do whatever you can to contribute to that so that person ultimately can go out and have a successful career as a singer-songwriter or whatever the artist is that you're working with. But it's kind of a combination of being a person in a band where you're contributing all your ideas, but also someone who is quite flexible and has a lot of sort of experience to be able to draw from in order to contribute ultimately what makes the song feel right to the artist or the producer or both, ideally. So
absolutely. And that kind of, yeah, for sure. That kind of bleeds into another question that we both had for you. I feel like this is in the back of a lot of musicians' minds, or at least young musicians who are just starting out. It's like, is being a session musician going to be as fulfilling as maybe having more creative control? So I want to ask you what your take on that has been. Like, when you go into someone else's project, do you feel like that is as creatively fulfilling as doing your own thing, or how does that differ?
Yeah, you know what? For me, it does completely. I'm not a singer-songwriter. I'm not a singer. If you heard me sing, I'd have no career whatsoever because I'm really bad at it. But I really enjoy contributing to other people's work. Now, I kind of got into co-writing and stuff when in the early days of working with Jann Arden, where we were quite collaborative, and it was fun for me to be able to contribute ideas or write, chord progressions and feels and different vibes and different sounds that inspired her to write lyrics and melodies to my musical ideas, and that's how we sort of collaborated, and that became sort of my musical contribution, and that was kind of a hybrid of both of those things that you're addressing, meaning that I was ultimately trying to serve a Jann Arden song, because it's not the Jann Arden band, it's her. She's accountable, she does all the interviews, I just get to hang out and sit in the background and play the guitar. But also, it was quite fulfilling because I would just sit alone and come up with these musical ideas and send them to her. And if she liked them, she would respond and write something to them. And then we would collaborate and ultimately find the final shape. So I'm kind of weird in the sense that there's not a lot of elements in my creative world where I am the face of the music I create and the person out there pushing it. But, you know, a lot of original sort of instrumental compositions I create. I do all the music for Jann Arden's TV series, so that's an outlet for that. Over the last year during COVID, I did a bunch of collaborations with a TV and film cameraman who works on like the X-Files and Fargo and Umbrella Academy. And we would do a series of 1-minute short films where he would send me some visuals, and then I would create something musically to match those visuals. And it was all very instinctual, and we worked very quickly. But really, it was just kind of a project to keep our creative juices flowing while the whole world was on pause. So that was something where, again, I had no rules. I could create whatever I wanted and contribute it to that. So I guess that is something that was quite fulfilling. But I also like working within limitations. You know, as a session musician and as a creator, if you have all the options in the world, I find that more stressful than, say, having to work on a pop country song as a session guitar player that has 3 chords that everyone's heard a million times before. I look within those limitations and figure out, well, how can I make something interesting inside of something that people are already tired of hearing, in a sense. So I like that challenge. I like limitation, and I like being a cog in a machine rather than being the entire machine. So.
We've talked a little bit about your background, musical background, specifically on guitar, but you're also really well known as a producer, of course. How did you first get into music production? What did that look like for you, and how can somebody who's interested in that get started?
Well, it was an extension of being a guitar player for me, because a producer, basically, how I look at it, treats the band like an instrument. So if I have a group of people I've hired to play on a record, or I'm working with a band, I'm trying to sort of coordinate everything to ultimately create a really interesting version of the song they bring to me that we're all working on. But it became just an extension of being in a band with Jann and touring and working on songs with her, and then wanting to see those songs get to a different end point than whenever we wrote a song and handed it off to another producer. And it wasn't because the producers we were working with were doing anything particularly wrong with the songs, because, you know, we were fortunate enough to be working with some of the best people, even to this day, that I've ever worked with and I've learned a ton from. But it's really neat to sort of see something through to the end. And as a songwriter with Jann, it just seemed like a natural progression for us to start producing her records. And really, that's where my production career kind of got started. It was just her and I kind of blindly going forward and creating stuff that made us excited about the songs and different sounds and putting different people in the room to contribute to it. But ultimately, being a producer, I feel, is an extension of being an instrumentalist. Because, you know, if I just played guitar all the time, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But for my brain, it just feels a little bit limited in a negative sense, not in a positive sense. Because I hear different instruments, you know, when I'm working on songs, I'm writing songs, and I hear different sort of parts and different elements. And as a producer, you get to try and discover those and put them all together. So it's just an extension of creativity that I think naturally happens at a certain stage in everyone's career. And I think that's a really good way to become a producer, because you're also coming at it understanding what it's like to be a musician on the other side of the control room. And know how to be directed. Therefore, as a producer, you know how to direct people and get the most out of them, or even how to put the right personalities in the room and know that you have as much faith as you can in these people, and you don't really have to tell them much because you've put the right combination of ingredients together that really you can't mess up, right?
I see. While we're talking about music production, can you share with us who are some of your favorite producers? Your favorite producers?
My favorite producers?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not a very reverent person, you know. There's people whose work I really like. It's funny because I think there's two really distinct styles of producers. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but someone like Daniel Lanois, who no matter what he works on, seems to add a sonic element that is ultimately traceable back to him. I think that's a great way to produce records, and I think it works really well for some artists. And then when I worked with Jann Arden in the earlier days, we worked with a producer named Ed Cherney, who did a lot of work with Bonnie Raitt and the Rolling Stones and people like that. And he was more of an engineer producer rather than a musician producer. So he didn't really contribute anything sound-wise or musically to the songs, but he sort of directed traffic and managed to put the right people in the room and get the right combination of personalities in order to make a song kind of blossom and sort of jump out of the speakers and be a lot more exciting. But you could listen to a lot of Ed Cherney's work and you wouldn't necessarily attribute it all to the same producer. And I really admire producers who are who can be transparent enough and understand that the record is not about them, it is about the artist, that they don't have a need to put a sonic stamp on what they do in order to have a sense of ownership with it. I think being a bit more of a transparent facilitator for an artist as a producer is a very admirable way to do it, but it definitely doesn't draw as much attention to the producer's job than someone who is contributing something sonically that has a very strong characteristic of what that person's musicality is. So yeah, I like those two kinds, and those are two, I guess, extreme examples of either side of that way of doing the job that I still continue to draw inspiration from by listening to their work.
Awesome. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about maybe some of your tips for young artists or bands who are looking at or going into the studio, preparing for the studio. What would you say to them to get ready?
Recording yourself and listening back very critically, not in the sense where you're putting yourself down or being too negative or too harsh on yourself, but being really honest. And there's a couple things that people tend to take for granted because they become quite numb to it, or if you're in a band and everyone plays kind of loud and you can't really hear what everyone's doing, you sort of don't realize things like timing and tuning. And as a producer, I know the majority of time I have to spend after I record songs with a band is editing it. And if the band isn't very good and I didn't catch that before we got in the studio, then you spend a lot of time doing math on the computer. And I didn't start playing guitar so I could become an IT guy. No disrespect to IT guys, but that's not where my brain works. But, I think it's being really honest with yourself and removing your ego from your contribution to the song, in the sense that if a part doesn't work and someone in the band says, your guitar part sucks, then maybe that deserves to be addressed and not just get all butthurt about it. And when you listen back to yourself playing, be really critical. Like, is my timing good? Am I rushing? Guitar players always tend to rush. Jory, you know this more than anybody. Guitar players always want to finish the song before everyone else in the band for some reason. So, is that something you need to really pay attention to? Absolutely. And tuning, like, am I playing the guitar in tune? Am I playing these parts in tune? Because when you get in a studio and you have all that energy and you want to express all of your musicality, if you can't do it in time or in tune, it becomes like, it starts to feel like a job, because you have to keep executing it until you get it right. And that can be extremely frustrating and even more so demoralizing for the musicians. And you can lose a lot of artistic and creative momentum if the band doesn't come in really well rehearsed and understanding everyone's role within the band. So as a producer, a lot of times I will spend the majority of time doing pre-production, meaning I'll sit in a rehearsal room with a band and we'll just rehearse. And we'll try different things. And in that scenario, there's no microphones, we're not recording it, there's no pressure, so we can try a bunch of ideas that maybe won't work, but ultimately they will result in something that is better than what the song sounded like before we all started collaborating on what the end result was going to be. So, and pre-production is one of those situations where, as a producer, if you get in there early enough and you notice some consistent issues with certain people in the band, you can either figure out how to tell them that they need to practice with a metronome and play guitar with a guitar tuner on and listen back to it and make sure that they're playing in tune. Or it's no disrespect to some of the people in a band, but sometimes you have to bring in a professional drummer on a younger band's recording, because maybe the drummer isn't quite up to the job. And what that can do is, even if you bring someone in for a couple of songs, it sort of lets them know the level that they have to attain in order to do that job effectively. So, I've been in the scenario where I've been hired to play guitar on something, and maybe I wasn't cutting it, and someone else was brought in to do the job better than I was doing it. And rather than looking at that as being a big affront or a big issue with my ego, it was a learning opportunity. And I think if you look at any scenario as a learning opportunity, then and remove your ego from it, then you're just gonna exponentially grow as a musician when you're exposed to people that have been doing the job longer and maybe can do it better at the time, but that doesn't mean you're not going to surpass them in the future. So,
yeah.
Russ, where do you see the future of music consumerism going? How are people going to purchase music, or how is that going to look maybe after the pandemic? Where do you think things are going to go in the next couple of years is basically what I'm asking you.
Oh man, I have no idea. And it's terrifying. I know for myself, as a copyright owner and a songwriter, I think Spotify is evil. But as a music consumer, I love it. I've been introduced to so much new music I never would have heard otherwise over this last year. And I'm very grateful for that. So streaming, I think, is becoming a very, a common way for people to consume music, a very easy way, and a great way to discover new music that is similar to things that you already like. So, I think my taste and my aesthetic musically, which is quite varied, there are days where I will listen to Sheepers, Maybe in the morning I'll be listening to Arvo Pärt, who's a minimalist composer from Estonia, and then at night I'm listening to the Stranglers. It just goes, I just like music that gives me a certain feeling. And as any dynamic human being, like both of you, sometimes you want to chill out, sometimes you want to rev it up, and there's different. For me, music has always been an emotional outlet for myself, so it's also inspired me emotionally with whatever emotional range we have as human beings. And streaming and Spotify and things like that have been a great way for me to have access to a lot of music that I love, and new music that is sort of vaguely reminiscent of music that I love, and introduce me to go down all these different rabbit holes of different bands that I get really excited about. But my Spotify playlists are pretty diverse and confusing, but I kind of like it that way.
Fair enough, for sure.
I've got a question for you that kind of switches gears a little bit here, but since I've got you here, I thought I might as well ask it. Growing up in Calgary, you've been a huge inspiration to many, many artists and many, many people in this city. And one big reason for that is that you live here. You're still here. You didn't come. You didn't leave. And even though you work everywhere, you're still based in your hometown. And I wanted to ask you why you never left. What? Because a lot of people, their dreams are to move away from wherever they are and go find it big somewhere else. But you've managed to really create, an amazing international career while still being based in somewhere like Calgary, Alberta. Why did you stay here? And what's your motivation behind helping cultivate music in Calgary?
Well, when I was 23, I started touring with Jann Arden, and I did that for 15 years straight. And that was 6 to 8 months of the year we were on the road, touring all over North America, Europe, everywhere. So I was lucky enough that I could be based out of Calgary, and I could go get on a plane and go play on The Tonight Show or whatever, and do all these things that, as a kid I always dreamed of being able to do. So I was lucky that at that point in my career, I really could have been based anywhere. I have family in Calgary. My kids are here, so I really don't want to leave, and I didn't want to. And what I found that working with Jann and working at that level, at that young age, it exposed me to a lot of. I kind of got this inside track to a lot of elements of the music business. And what I saw was that some of the bigger centers just had more of everything. You know, like you go to New York and it's got more restaurants and it's got more musicians and it's got just more of everything. And because of that, you obviously the bar is much higher, and you have a bunch of incredible musicians, and but also you have a huge amount of people that are kind of okay musicians. And the thing about Calgary that I liked was I could come home from being on tour and being exposed to some amazing things, and then I would look at local musicians and I would see things that had potential in them that I think a lot of people here were either numb to or they didn't see. So I thought that seemed to be a bit of a superpower for me, where I could, you know, I would go and see a band at the Republic or something, and everyone would say, "Oh, this headliner band is great," and I'd be like, "No, the opening band was one of the best things I've ever seen, and no one was there." But I was lucky enough that I got to sort of see great music, and then when I came back to Calgary, I could see the seeds of great music happening here, and I felt like that was something that I wanted to help cultivate and be a part of. And rather than go to Toronto and be just another person competing for the same, you know, records for the same 20 artists that are signed to Canadian major labels, I could work with more independent artists and have a bit more artistic leeway and a bit more opportunity to be collaborative. Whereas maybe the infrastructure for those artists and their potential for getting music out into the world wasn't quite as strong as some of these people in other cities. But I felt like I could be more creative here, and I didn't have to do one thing. The thing about moving to a big city, I think you have to really hone what your sound is and what you contribute, and then be very niche like. Whereas my brain doesn't work well that way. I you know, like this last year, I produced a song with Jason McCoy that was a kind of a charity single that featured a whole bunch of country artists and people like Ed Robertson from Bare Naked Ladies and a bunch of Nashville session musicians. And I got to work on that, and then I did a record for a fella named Art Bergman, who's sort of a prototypical punk hero in Canada from the late 70s, early 80s, who was a very acerbic, very political songwriter, and his execution of everything is quite raw. So I'm going from producing, you know, a Jason McCoy, very polished kind of pop country rock song, to working with a very raw political extreme talent like Art Bergman. And then at the same time, Jann Arden and I wrote another record, and it's now actually a producer named Bob Rock is mixing all of our tracks right now.
Awesome.
So it's exciting. It's going to be it's a really interesting record, because writing music during COVID is so messed up, because you have no external stimulus. All you do is draw from inside and see what comes out. But the fact that I got to work on three, you know, that's just a portion of, I've been very fortunate this past year where I've been extremely busy, but three really high profile jobs that have nothing in common. If I wasn't living off the grid in a place like Calgary, I don't think I would have grown into having the opportunity to work on three things that were so incredibly diverse yet fulfilling in different ways for me. So I've tried to look at living, because I mean, Calgary artistically, you know, to be blunt, it sucks. You know, arts are not valued here in the way that they are in other places. They're not part of the fabric of everything. But, you know, I think there are some great flowers growing in the concrete here. I think there's some exceptional artists. There's some world-class musicians. Jory, you're probably one of the finest bass players and musicians I've ever seen, and you live in Calgary too. So, you know, but we tend to eat our young here, and we tend to think that because it's from Calgary, it's not as good as something outside of here. But I don't agree with that. I think there's a lot of people that come here from different places and different centers, and they see the talent we have, and they see a lot of it of raw talent, because we don't really have the infrastructure to develop artists as much as I think we'd all like to have here. But there's exceptional raw talent here. And a lot of times people have to leave in order to fulfill that dream of becoming a Feist or a Tegan and Sarah, or, you know, Terry Clark, or all these people. But I've enjoyed being here and being able to help cultivate an artistic community and be a part of one that has a bit more of a rawness and an honesty to it that isn't overtaken by the ambition that you see other artists getting caught up in bigger centers, where maybe the content suffers, yet they have really great social media.
Thanks for that answer, Russ. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Awesome. I wanted to ask you, so we talked a little, well, I mean, according to a young artist, it's a lot easier to go about getting into maybe a project like we talked about, a band where they're immersed in the project because there's social media, there's friends hanging out and all of those types of things. But how do young artists go about starting to get into the world of session playing? Do you have some tips in that regard?
You know, I get that question a lot, and it's weird. I wish I had a decent answer for it, but in all honesty, I don't. I got into it because I had a finger in a few different pies. You know, like working with Jann gave me a certain level of notoriety that people associated my playing with something successful, and then they wanted to take that and put that on their own record. So I guess for, you know, if your dream is to play music and become a session musician, maybe you should get in a band first that has some level of success or some kind of level of notoriety that you can be associated with. Therefore, people come to you because they think what you're contributing to their project, you're more of an asset, because they can not only appreciate your musical contribution, but they can talk about what you've done and the fact that they can associate with you, and that gives them a different level of credibility. So I think for a young musician, like if it means starting a band or being a singer-songwriter and getting out there and working as hard as you can and doing that, and then, you know, maybe being a session musician becomes something you do after that band breaks up. I don't know. It's hard to say, but the job is to show up on time and be prepared and have instruments that sound good and do all your homework and make the producer and the artist's job as effortless and as easy as possible. And I think in order to do that effectively, it takes a fair bit of experience, and it takes a fair bit of and one way to get that experience is, you know, to be in a band and to hire a producer to produce your band. And then you, as you're being produced, you understand the ask of what a guitar player or a drummer, an instrumentalist requires, is required to contribute to any sort of recording session. So I'd say, yeah, you know, get in a band, get as famous and as well known and as popular as you can doing that, and then from there, if you want to get into sessions, at least you have something on your business card that people value, other than just what you can do. Because there's tons of great musicians, like there's you know, I could probably sneeze and sneeze on a guitar player who's a better guitar player than me, walking down any street in Calgary. But I know for a fact that I'm easy to work with, and I show up on time, and I'm flexible, and I have a really good attitude, because ultimately I want to learn something in that scenario. It's not about me. It's about what can I contribute and how can I be a part of something that is bigger than me. So a lot of it is attitude, but yeah, I think you have to have a certain level of notoriety in order for people to want to have anything to do with you. And in this day and age, it could be, you know, it could be you just playing guitar on Instagram and playing so great that people want what you do to be associated with their career and their project. I know when I was a kid, those kind of things, social media and such, didn't exist, but it also didn't seem to have the impact as far as spreading awareness of what someone's ability and talent is.
We're going to ask you some of your favorite albums, but before that, I'd like to ask you, who are some of your favorite guitarists? Who should young guitarists listen to?
Wow. Young guitarists, I think, should listen to Band of Gypsies, the live Jimi Hendrix record, because I still think it's the best guitar record ever made. In the sense that if you listen to the first song, you can hear him break a string, and then he spends 3 or 4 minutes fixing it, and then he comes back in, and it's still, you know, of all the songs they could have chosen from those live recordings to put on the record, that song just had some kind of voodoo about it, that they kept the mistake in and didn't edit it, and that tells you how great the intent and the musicianship on that record could be. And I still think, you know, live Hendrix stuff is the bar as far as, you know, really good creative blues rock guitar playing. I'm a huge 60s Cream era Clapton fan. The others, and even before that, the John Mayall stuff. I've always been a blues guy. I love blues guitar playing because it's so simple, yet when someone is really good it's you can tell who they are within 3 notes of them playing something, and that's pretty rare, as a guitar player. I also love guys that play on records and come up with parts. There was a guy named David Rhodes who played with Peter Gabriel for years, and he did a lot of really interesting contributions to this band named Talk Talk, to their records, and sonic landscape stuff and stuff that almost sounds like keyboards, but still had this evocative, this really emotional sort of nature to it. So I'm a huge fan of his playing. I think Daniel Lanois is a great guitar player. Jeepers, there's guys now from, like, it seems like everybody in Winnipeg is the best guitar player in the world right now, and rightfully so. Guys like Joey Landreth, who plays guitar the way he sings, and it's this beautiful, incredibly articulate and sensitive sort of way of speaking through the instrument. And Ariel Posen, who's just an absolutely incredible and inspiring guitar player. Guys like that, St. Vincent, she's great. Listening to her stuff, she comes at things from a completely different angle, and I sit and listen to her music and try and reverse engineer it, and I don't understand it. And I love that. I love people that kind of shock me and do something that I just don't quite understand. But overall, I don't listen to guitar players. I always go through periods where I want to get better at playing the instrument, so I listen to guitar players and try and rip things off, but I always get really bored of it. I just like music. I don't really like any... I probably like drummers more. If you ask me about drummers, I probably have a list of 30 people that I'm absolutely in awe of and completely in love with, far more than guitar players, because I find them much more interesting.
Well, let's talk about all of it then. Maybe Maddie and I always ask our guests, like desert island albums. Who would you? What are some essential albums that would be in the Russell Broom collection that you would take if you were stuck on a desert island? What are five?
Sure. Okay. No pressure. I'm really old and I've listened to a lot of music, so but definitely Jimi Hendrix Band of Gypsies, absolutely, without question. There's a really good Arvo Pärt, who's the Estonian composer I was talking about earlier. I love minimalist music because I tend to work in these very, like doing music for a television show is an extremely high stress job. Usually what happens is you have some like barely achievable ask in the 11th hour that you have to just shut up and do. So my days can be pretty hectic and pretty intense, and sometimes how I like to come down from that is to listen to someone playing one note on a cello for 90 seconds and then going to the second note. It's something that just slows down my metabolism, it slows down my brain, it lets me just sort of ease back into the regular world and not feel so incredibly overwhelmed. So yeah, there's a lot of great Arvo Pärt recordings. Sigur Rós is another band that I absolutely adore. Radiohead is a band that I still listen to quite often. And really, you could pick any of the records that they've put out, would still be pivotal. Wrecking Ball by Emmylou Harris, I think, is one of the most interesting and unique albums made in the last 40 years, because it's ethereal and it's ambient and it's rooted at the same time, and you have this beautiful angelic voice over top of these dark and sort of stormy sounds, and it's such a beautiful hybrid of emotions that it's something I still listen to this day quite often. And I love just snotty, obnoxious new wave and punk rock stuff. It's great. I just love music that feels energetic. Like I'll put a Blur record on and drink a glass of wine most nights. I like a lot of British music. I was born in the UK, so and I grew up hearing a lot of British music. So that's sort of ingrained in my DNA, and to this day, that whole. Like I went and saw Radiohead in Glasgow, Jeepers, in the early 2000s. And it was a crowd of soccer people and people wearing soccer shirts, drinking beer in the rain. It was kind of like going to the Stampede. But everyone was singing every word to every song at the top of their lungs. And those are complex melodies and complex songs. And I was just like, this is incredible. Like, it feels like I'm at an AC/DC concert, but it's something way more sort of arty sounding. Not to, because AC/DC still are, you know, Back in Black is definitely a desert island record, but you know, this was something that was complex, but it created this emotional response in a bunch of people that were drunk and wet in the rain. And I thought, well, man, you know, if that's the power of music over in Glasgow, where, you know, it's a bunch of drunk soccer fans watching this art band, and then you go see them in Calgary and everyone's like this, like they're expecting something, and it's like, it's just music, lighten up, you know. It's not, we're not delivering a liver transplant to the children's hospital, someone's playing a guitar in front of you, just lighten up and have fun. And it was so nice to hear beautiful, artistic, and intense music in that context, that I was, that shows you the true power of melody and stuff like that. But yeah, that's probably a few sort of desert island records.
That's great.
Yeah, if that helps at all.
Absolutely. So the last thing I kind of wanted to ask was, we usually end off on this, is you've given so much already, but if you could sum it up into like one piece of advice that you would want to leave off with the next generation of young musicians, what would you say to them?
Don't be afraid to be who you are, and don't follow other people. You know, be inspired by other artists, but don't feel that, don't compare your chapter 2 to someone's chapter 12 in your musical career, you know, and trust your ears. If something sounds right to you, then you'll find a place to make it resonate in the world. But don't let people take away your individuality. Don't let people tell you that something that you love doesn't have value. Like, ignore that completely, and trust your gut, you know, like, because that's the only thing that's going to make you, I think, an asset. You know, I get hired to play guitar because I play a certain way, and that's always been my dream, is to get hired to play like how I play. I rarely go on a session and have to mimic someone else. Extremely rare. Usually it's people who hire me that don't know me or have never worked with me. And then, you know, sometimes it's funny, they'll be like, I don't know if you've heard of this guy who plays on these Jann Arden records, but can you do something like that? And I'll kind of go, okay, I think I might be able to. That's only happened once, but it was, and I didn't say anything. But
really, you didn't say anything?
No.
Oh,
I don't want to embarrass the guy. It's a producer. But it's, you know, it's just be true to yourself and be true to your musicality and follow your ear and develop your ear, you know, and develop the things that you like that are interesting, because there's so much music out there and it's difficult to cut through. And the only way to do it, I think, is to just be 100% you from Concentrate, you know.
Good answer. Russ, I know that you're really busy these days. We sure appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for all the questions. And it's great to see you both.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, well, take care. Thanks so much, Russ. We'll talk again.
Cheers. Take care.